Mark returned home at 8 in the evening, as always. The key turned in the lock as usual, but something was wrong. Silence. Sarah always played music when she cooked dinner. "Sarah?" he called, taking off his jacket. No answer. On the kitchen table lay a white sheet of paper, folded in half. His heart stopped for a moment. He unfolded the note. "Sorry," one word written in her handwriting. Mark reread the note 3 times. The word didn't change. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number, straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. They had been together for 2 years. 2 years of morning coffee together, weekend trips, and talks about moving in together permanently. Sarah worked as a librarian at the downtown branch. She was quiet, thoughtful, with a smile that made his worst days better. She never talked much about her past, but that seemed normal. Not everyone liked to dwell on old memories. Mark searched the apartment. Her clothes were gone from the closet. The bathroom shelf where she kept her things was empty. Even her favorite coffee mug was missing from the kitchen cabinet. It was as if she had never lived here. He called her work the next morning. "Sarah didn't come in today," her colleague Linda said. "Actually, she called yesterday and said she was quitting." Didn't give any reason. "We were all surprised. The police officer who took his report looked bored. Adults have the right to leave, sir." No signs of struggle, no threats. She left a note. "Seems pretty clear she wanted to go. But she wouldn't just leave like this," Mark insisted. "We were planning to get engaged next month." "People change their minds," the officer shrugged. "Happens more than you'd think." Mark's friends were supportive but equally puzzled. "Maybe she got cold feet about the engagement," his brother suggested. "Some people panic when things get serious." But Mark knew Sarah. She didn't panic. She was the most level-headed person he'd ever met. There had to be another explanation. 3 days later, while packing her remaining books, he found it. Behind a stack of novels on the bottom shelf was a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. It was locked, but the wood was old, and the latch gave way easily. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with rubber bands. The paper was yellowed with age. Mark's hands shook as he picked up the first bundle. The letters were addressed to Elizabeth Cole at addresses he'd never heard Sarah mention. The postmarks were from 15 years ago. He opened the first letter. "My dearest Beth," it began, "I hope this letter finds you safe in your new life. The marshals told us not to contact you, but I had to let you know that Mom is doing better after the surgery." Mark's breath caught. Marshals? New life? Who was Elizabeth Cole? He read letter after letter. They painted a picture of a woman who had vanished from her family's life, leaving behind parents, a sister, and friends who missed her desperately. The letters spoke of someone in witness protection, someone who had testified against dangerous people and had to disappear to stay alive. At the bottom of the box was an old driver's license. The photo showed Sarah's face, but the name read Elizabeth Cole. The address was in Portland, Oregon. Mark had never known Sarah to live in Oregon. There was also a newspaper clipping from the Portland Tribune, dated 16 years ago. The headline read, "Key Witness Testifies in Major Racketeering Case." The article was brief, mentioning an unnamed witness whose testimony had led to the conviction of several members of the Castellano crime family. Mark sat on the floor surrounded by the letters, trying to process what he'd discovered. The woman he loved, the woman he'd planned to marry, wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Elizabeth Cole, and she'd been living under witness protection for 15 years. But why had she left now? What had changed? The answer came the next morning when he checked his email. There was a message from an address he didn't recognize. watchfuleye47@gmail.com. "Your girlfriend is not who you think she is," the email read. "Elizabeth Cole thought she could hide forever, but the Castellanos never forget. She ran to protect you, but it won't matter. We know where you live. We know where you work. If you try to find her, you'll both pay the price." Mark's blood ran cold. Someone had been watching them. Someone had discovered Sarah's real identity and threatened her. She hadn't left him because she didn't love him. She'd left to protect him. He deleted the email immediately and looked around his apartment with new eyes. Was someone watching him right now? Had they been watching Sarah for weeks, months, waiting for the right moment to strike? One thing was clear. He had to find her. But he also had to be smart about it. If the people who were after Sarah discovered he was looking for her, it would put them both in danger. Mark made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't go to the police. If Sarah was still in witness protection, they might not be able to help. Or worse, they might accidentally compromise her location. He would find her himself, using the clues in the letters and the skills he'd learned as a journalist before switching to his current job in marketing. But first, he needed to disappear from his own life for a while, just like Sarah had. He called in sick to work and told his family he was taking a short vacation. He paid cash for everything and turned off his phone's location services. The hunt for Elizabeth Cole was about to begin, and Mark prayed he would find her before her enemies did. Mark spent the next morning at the public library, using their computers to research everything he could find about Elizabeth Cole and the Castellano case. He was careful not to use his own devices. If someone was monitoring him, they might track his searches. The court records were mostly sealed, but newspaper archives told the story. 16 years ago, Elizabeth Cole had been a junior accountant at Castellano Construction, a front company for one of Portland's most powerful crime families. She had discovered evidence of money laundering and had been brave enough to come forward to federal prosecutors. Her testimony had resulted in convictions for tax evasion, racketeering, and conspiracy charges against 5 members of the Castellano organization, including the patriarch Vincent Castellano, who received a 20-year sentence. But Vincent's son, Michael, had escaped prosecution. The articles hinted that he had fled the country before charges could be filed. Michael Castellano was described as more ruthless than his father, someone who believed in settling scores personally. Mark printed everything he could find and drove to Portland. The journey took him 6 hours, and he paid cash for gas and a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city. He couldn't use credit cards. They would leave a trail. Elizabeth's old address led him to a modest apartment complex in southeast Portland. The current tenant, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, had lived there for 10 years and knew nothing about the previous resident. But she directed Mark to the building manager, who had been there longer. "Oh, Beth Cole," the manager, a heavy-set man named Jim, remembered. "Sweet girl, but quiet. Always seemed nervous, like she was looking over her shoulder." Left suddenly one night, federal marshals came by the next day asking questions. "Do you remember anything else about her?" Mark asked. Jim scratched his beard thoughtfully. "She worked at the library downtown. Had a friend there, another librarian named Carol Martinez. You might try there." The Portland Central Library was a beautiful old building with tall windows and polished wood floors. Mark found Carol Martinez in the reference section. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Beth?" Carol's face lit up with recognition. "I haven't thought about her in years. She was such a good employee, but she always seemed scared of something. Then one day she just didn't come in. Her apartment was cleaned out. We figured it had to do with that court case. She'd been so stressed during the trial. Did she ever mention where she might go if she had to leave Portland?" Carol hesitated. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Beth used to talk about her grandmother's house in small-town Oregon. Said it was the only place she'd ever felt truly safe. I think it was somewhere near the coast, but I can't remember the name of the town." Mark thanked Carol and spent the rest of the afternoon at the Oregon Historical Society looking through old phone directories and property records. He found 3 Elizabeth Coles who had owned property in coastal Oregon towns, but only one had the right age profile. Elizabeth May Cole had owned a small house in Manzanita, Oregon, until her death 12 years ago. The property had been left to her granddaughter, Elizabeth Cole. Manzanita was a tiny town on the Oregon coast. Population less than 600. It was the perfect place to hide. Mark checked out of his Portland motel and drove west toward the ocean. The house was exactly what he'd expected. A small, weathered cottage 2 blocks from the beach, surrounded by pine trees and rhododendron bushes. But when Mark knocked on the door, a middle-aged man answered. "You looking for the Cole girl?" the man asked when Mark explained he was trying to find the owner. "She sold me this place about 3 years ago. Said she needed the money for a fresh start. Never saw her again." Mark's heart sank, but the man continued. "She did leave a forwarding address for any mail. Got it somewhere inside if you want to wait." The forwarding address was in Seattle, Washington. Mark was back on the road within an hour. Seattle was where the trail should have led to Sarah, but instead it led to another dead end. The address was for a mail forwarding service that had closed 2 years ago. The owner, a suspicious man who answered the door in his bathrobe despite it being mid-afternoon, claimed he'd destroyed all records. But Mark was starting to understand how Sarah operated. She layered her deceptions, created false trails, and always had an escape plan. It was exactly what someone in witness protection would learn to do. He was sitting in his car outside the defunct mail service, feeling defeated when his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking for her, or you'll both regret it." Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Whoever was threatening them was still watching, still tracking his movements. But instead of frightening him, the message gave him hope. If they were telling him to stop looking, it meant they hadn't found Sarah yet either. That evening, in another cheap motel room, Mark spread out all the letters from Sarah's hidden box. He read them again, more carefully this time, looking for clues he might have missed. In a letter from her sister dated 3 years ago, he found it. "I know you can't contact us directly, but if you ever need help, remember what Dad always said about the place where the mountains meet the sea. Uncle Raymond is still there, still fixing boats and asking about you. Mountains meeting the sea. Uncle Raymond. Boats." Mark grabbed his laptop and started searching. After an hour of research, he found a Raymond Cole listed as a boat repair specialist in Bellingham, Washington, a town where the Cascade Mountains met Puget Sound. He had found Sarah's safe house. But as Mark prepared for the final leg of his journey, he noticed a car in the motel parking lot that he'd seen outside the Portland Library. Someone was definitely following him, and they were getting closer to finding Sarah with every move he made. The game of cat and mouse was about to reach its climax. Mark left Seattle at dawn, but not before taking precautions. He'd learned enough from Sarah's careful methods to know that whoever was following him was professional. At a 24-hour Walmart, he bought a baseball cap, sunglasses, and a change of clothes. He paid cash and left through the back exit. Instead of taking the direct route to Bellingham, he drove east toward Spokane for 2 hours, then doubled back on smaller highways. In his rearview mirror, he spotted the same dark sedan that had been at the motel. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. At a truck stop outside of Mount Vernon, Mark called the FBI from a payphone. He asked to speak to someone about witness protection violations. After being transferred 3 times, he reached Agent Jennifer Walsh. "Mr. Thompson, I can't discuss active WITSEC cases with civilians," Agent Walsh said after he explained the situation. "But someone's threatening us. They found Sarah, Elizabeth, and now they're after me too. If you have evidence of a crime, bring it to your local FBI office. But sir, people in witness protection sometimes choose to relocate on their own. It doesn't necessarily mean they're in danger." "What about the Castellano family? Are they still active?" There was a long pause. "Mr. Thompson, I strongly advise you to stop whatever you're doing and let law enforcement handle this. Some situations are more dangerous than civilians understand." The line went dead. Mark realized he was truly on his own. Bellingham was a picturesque town surrounded by water and mountains. The harbor was filled with fishing boats and pleasure craft. Mark found Raymond Cole's boat repair shop on the south side of the marina, a weathered building with Cole Marine Services painted on a faded sign. Raymond Cole was in his 60s with calloused hands and suspicious eyes. When Mark introduced himself as Sarah's boyfriend, the man's expression hardened. "Don't know any Sarah," Raymond said, turning back to the engine he was working on. "Elizabeth, then? Your niece. I know she's been in contact with you." Raymond set down his wrench and studied Mark carefully. "If you're who you say you are, then you know why she had to leave. And you know that coming here puts her in more danger. Someone's after both of us now. I got threatening messages. There's a car that's been following me for 2 days. Show me your hands," Raymond said suddenly. Mark held out his hands, confused. "Beth told me about you. Said you had a scar on your left index finger from a childhood accident with a kitchen knife. Said it looked like a crescent moon." Mark looked down at the small curved scar he'd had so long he barely noticed it anymore. "She remembered that?" Raymond's expression softened slightly. "She remembered everything about you. That's why leaving nearly killed her. Where is she?" "Gone. Left here 3 days ago when she got word that someone was asking questions in Portland. Said if anyone came looking, especially someone claiming to be her boyfriend, I should tell them she'd headed to Canada. But she didn't go to Canada. No, Raymond admitted. She went south. Has a friend in Northern California who's been helping people like her start over. But kid, if that car followed you here, then they'll figure out the same things you did. You're putting her in danger just by looking for her. Mark felt despair creeping in. Every step closer to finding Sarah seemed to bring their enemies closer too. There's something else you should know, Raymond continued. The people after Beth, they're not just the Castellanos anymore. Word is that Michael Castellano is dead, killed in a power struggle 3 years ago. But before he died, he put out a contract on her. Anyone who fulfills it gets $250,000. That kind of money brings out all kinds of dangerous people. So it's not just one family anymore. It's anyone who wants the bounty exactly. And Beth knows it. That's why she's been moving every few months, never staying anywhere long enough to get comfortable. Mark's phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. Found the boat shop. You have 1 hour to disappear, or we'll assume you know where she is. He showed the message to Raymond, whose face went pale. They're here, Raymond whispered. In my shop. After 50 years in this town, he grabbed a shotgun from behind the counter. You need to leave. Now. There's a back exit through the storage room. Come with me. This is my place. I'm not running. Raymond checked his shotgun. But you are. Beth gave me something to give you if anyone ever came looking. He handed Mark a small piece of paper with an address in Eureka, California, and a phone number. That's where she's headed. But don't call that number unless you're absolutely sure you're not being followed. One mistake could get her killed. Mark heard car doors slamming outside the front of the shop. Go, Raymond hissed. The back door leads to an alley. There's a bus station 6 blocks east. Get out of town any way you can, but don't use your car. They probably put a tracker on it. Mark slipped out the back as he heard Raymond greeting visitors at the front of the shop with forced casualness. Can I help you, gentlemen? The bus to Seattle left 20 minutes later. Mark sat in the back, wearing his baseball cap and sunglasses, watching through the rear window as Bellingham disappeared behind him. He couldn't see if anyone was following the bus, but he had to assume they were. From Seattle, he took another bus to Portland, then another to Eureka. The journey took 18 hours, and he paid cash for everything. At every stop, he watched for familiar faces or cars. By the time he reached Eureka, Mark was exhausted, paranoid, and desperate. He had one advantage. He was now ahead of his pursuers for the first time. But he also knew that advantage wouldn't last long. The address Raymond had given him was for a small cafe called The Driftwood near the Eureka waterfront. It was the kind of place locals went for coffee and conversation, unremarkable and easily overlooked. Mark ordered coffee and waited. After an hour, a woman approached his table. She was in her 40s with short gray hair and alert eyes. You're Mark, she said quietly. I'm Helen. Beth is waiting. Helen led Mark through the back streets of Eureka to a small house nestled among towering redwoods. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and Mark noticed security cameras hidden among the trees. She's been expecting you, Helen said as they approached the front door. But she's terrified that your coming here means they're close behind. The door opened before they reached it. Sarah stood in the doorway, and Mark's heart nearly stopped. She looked exhausted, thinner than when she'd left, with dark circles under her eyes. But she was alive. Mark, she whispered. And then she was in his arms. They held each other for a long moment before Sarah pulled back, her eyes filled with tears and fear. You shouldn't have come, she said. Every step you took to find me brought them closer. I had to, Mark replied. I love you. I don't care what your real name is or what happened in your past. I just need you to be safe inside the house. Helen made tea while Sarah explained everything. Her real story was even more complicated than the letters had revealed. I wasn't just an accountant who stumbled onto evidence, Sarah began. I was recruited by the FBI. They needed someone on the inside of Castellano Construction to gather evidence. I was young, stupid, and thought I was being patriotic. You were undercover? For 8 months. I copied financial records, recorded conversations, took photographs. I had no idea how dangerous it was until Vincent Castellano's lieutenant started getting suspicious. The FBI pulled me out just days before I would have been killed. And Michael Castellano put out the contract when his father went to prison. Not immediately. At first, I was just another protected witness. But 3 years ago, Michael was murdered by a rival family. Before he died, he used his last resources to put a permanent bounty on my head. He wanted revenge even from the grave Sarah showed Mark, a thick folder filled with documentation, new identities she'd used, places she'd lived, close calls she'd survived. I've been Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca Foster, and 4 other names. I thought I could finally stay in one place when I became Sarah Mitchell and met you. For 2 years, I was happy. I thought maybe I could have a normal life. What changed? Helen's network picked up chatter that someone had traced Sarah Mitchell to our city. They had photos of us together, Mark. They knew where we lived, where we worked. I had maybe hours before they found me. Helen joined the conversation. I run an underground railroad for people in situations like Sarah's. People the government can't or won't protect anymore. We help them disappear completely. But why didn't you tell me? Mark asked Sarah. We could have figured this out together. Because I love you too much to destroy your life, Sarah said, tears flowing freely now. Do you understand what being with me means? It means never using your real name again. It means never seeing your family. It means looking over your shoulder every day for the rest of your life. That's my choice to make. Not if you don't understand the consequences. Mark, these aren't movie villains. They're real people who kill for money. The bounty on my head is still active, and it will be until everyone who knows about it is dead. Helen's phone buzzed. She answered it, listened briefly, then hung up with a grim expression. We have a problem, she said. My contact in Bellingham says Raymond's shop was searched after you left. They didn't hurt him, but they found evidence that someone had been there recently. They also found your abandoned car. They know you're on the West Coast. How long do we have? Sarah asked. Hours, maybe less. There are only so many places someone could disappear to from Bellingham. They'll check San Francisco, Portland, and here. We need to move now. Sarah looked at Mark with desperate eyes. This is your last chance to walk away. If you come with me now, there's no going back to your old life. Ever Mark thought about his job, his apartment, his family and friends, everything he'd worked for, everything that had defined him for 32 years. Then he looked at the woman he loved, the woman who had sacrificed her own happiness to keep him safe. Where are we going, Inon? He asked. Helen smiled for the first time since they'd met. I have a boat. We'll go up the coast to a place I know in Washington State. There are people there who specialize in creating new identities that even the best investigators can't trace. And then you disappear completely. New names, new lives, somewhere far from here. Maybe Montana, maybe North Dakota, somewhere the Castellano bounty hunters will never think to look. They spent the next hour gathering supplies and destroying any evidence of Sarah's presence in the house. Helen's operation was clearly well practiced. Within 90 minutes, it was as if Sarah had never been there. As they prepared to leave for the boat, Mark realized he was about to become someone else entirely. Mark Thompson would cease to exist, just as Elizabeth Cole and Sarah Mitchell had ceased to exist. But as he looked at Sarah, Elizabeth, the woman whose real name he still didn't know, he realized it didn't matter. Love wasn't about names or histories or the life you'd planned. It was about the person you chose to face an uncertain future with. Ready? Helen asked, keys in hand. Mark took Sarah's hand. Let's go. Behind them, the house that had been a safe haven went dark. Ahead of them lay the unknown. New names, a new life, and the hope that this time, they might truly escape the shadows of the past. But as they drove through the redwoods toward the coast, none of them noticed the black SUV that fell in behind them, maintaining a careful distance in the darkness. The hunters were closer than they knew. The boat was a 40-foot fishing vessel moored at a private dock outside Eureka. Helen worked quickly to prepare for departure, while Mark and Sarah gathered supplies. The plan was to travel north along the coast under cover of darkness, staying in international waters to avoid any potential surveillance. Once we reach Washington, I have contacts who can get you across the border into Canada, Helen explained as she checked the navigation equipment. From there, you can disappear completely. Sarah was quiet as they prepared to leave, and Mark could see the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She was about to abandon another identity, another life, but this time she wouldn't be alone. They were casting off the mooring lines when Mark spotted headlights turning into the marina parking area. "Helen," he said quietly. She looked up and saw what he was seeing. Three black vehicles were approaching fast, their headlights cutting through the fog that was rolling in from the ocean. "Get below," Helen ordered, starting the engines. "Both of you." Now the boat lurched forward as Helen pushed the throttles to full power. Mark and Sarah stumbled down into the cabin as the sound of car doors slamming echoed across the water behind them. Through the cabin's small porthole, Mark could see flashlights on the dock. Men in dark clothing were running toward the water, but the boat was already pulling away into the harbor. "Do you think we made it?" Sarah whispered. Their answer came in the form of a spotlight that suddenly blazed to life from somewhere behind them. A powerful boat engine roared to life, and Mark realized their pursuers had access to watercraft too. Helen's voice came down from the bridge, tense but controlled. "They're following us. I'm going to try to lose them in the fog, but if they have radar." The chase that followed was unlike anything Mark had experienced. Helen maneuvered the fishing boat through the fog with skill born of decades on the water, using her knowledge of the coastline to navigate channels that would be treacherous for someone unfamiliar with the area. But their pursuers were persistent. The spotlight kept finding them through the fog, and the sound of the chase boat's engines never seemed to fade. "There's a cove about 2 miles north," Helen called down. "If we can reach it, there are caves where we can hide the boat, but we'll have to go ashore and continue on foot." 20 minutes later, they reached the hidden cove. Helen guided the boat into a narrow inlet between towering rocks, then into a cave that was invisible from the water. The sound of their engines echoed off the cave walls as Helen shut them down. "We wait here until dawn," she whispered. "If they didn't see us come in here, they'll assume we continued north." They spent the next 6 hours in the cave, listening for sounds of pursuit. As the sun rose, Helen carefully navigated the boat back out of the cave and checked the horizon with binoculars. "Clear," she announced. "I think we lost them." But as they continued north, Mark noticed that Sarah had been quiet for too long. She was sitting in the stern of the boat, staring back toward the coast they'd left behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked, sitting beside her. "This will never end," she said softly. "There will always be another boat, another chase, another close call, and eventually our luck will run out. We'll be more careful. We'll disappear so completely that—" "No." Sarah turned to look at him with eyes that had made a decision. "I'm done running, Mark. I've been running for 15 years and it's destroyed every good thing in my life. I won't let it destroy us." "What are you saying?" Sarah stood up and walked to where Helen was steering the boat. "I want to make a deal," she told Helen. "Contact the FBI. Tell them Elizabeth Cole is ready to testify again." Helen nearly dropped the wheel. "Sarah, that's suicide. The moment you surface, every bounty hunter in the country will know where you are." "Maybe. Or maybe it's time to end this properly. The original case was about money laundering and racketeering. But over the years, I've learned things about other crimes, other families. I've been watching, listening, gathering evidence everywhere I've lived." Sarah pulled out a small storage device from her jacket. 15 years of documentation, names, places, financial records, recorded conversations. Enough to bring down not just the people still hunting me, but their associates, their money sources, their entire network. Mark stared at her. "You've been building a case all this time. What else was I supposed to do with my life? I couldn't have a career, a family, or friends. So I made it my mission to gather evidence against the people who stole my life." Helen was shaking her head. "Even if the FBI can use your evidence, testifying will put you right back in the spotlight. The bounty will still be active. Not if we make a different kind of deal," Sarah said. "I give them everything I have. In exchange, they help us fake my death. Elizabeth Cole dies officially and permanently. The bounty becomes worthless because the target no longer exists." It was a desperate plan, but as Mark thought about it, he realized it might work. If Sarah could provide enough evidence to justify the FBI's cooperation, they might be willing to help her disappear in a way that would end the threat permanently. There's a field office in Portland, Helen said reluctantly. I know someone there who might listen. But this is incredibly risky. Everything we've done has been risky, Sarah replied. At least this way, we're taking control instead of just reacting. 3 days later, Mark sat in a federal courthouse in Portland, watching through bulletproof glass as Sarah testified before a grand jury. Her evidence was even more extensive than she'd revealed. She had documented connections between the Castellano organization and criminal enterprises across the country. Agent Walsh, the same FBI agent who had dismissed Mark's phone call, was now leading a task force based on Sarah's information. She's given us enough to issue warrants for 63 individuals, Walsh told Mark during a break in the proceedings. This is the biggest organized crime case we've developed in a decade. And the deal? If the grand jury returns indictments based on her testimony, we'll arrange for Elizabeth Cole to die officially. Car accident, closed casket, death certificate, the works. The bounty will be canceled because the target will be legally dead. And then you both get new identities through official channels. Real ones this time, backed by federal resources. You'll be able to live normal lives. The plan worked better than anyone had hoped. Within 6 months, the evidence Sarah provided had led to one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in years. The remaining members of the Castellano organization and dozens of associates were arrested. Elizabeth Cole's funeral was held on a rainy Tuesday in Portland. The FBI made sure the death was reported in newspapers across the country. The bounty was officially canceled when proof of death was provided to the criminal networks that had been seeking her. Mark Thompson also died that week in a hiking accident in the Cascade Mountains. His family mourned at a funeral attended by FBI agents posing as friends. 6 months later, in a small town in Montana, David and Emma Stevens were married in a simple ceremony at the local courthouse. The bride was a freelance graphic designer who had recently moved to town. The groom was a high school English teacher who had been hired for the fall semester. They bought a house near the mountains, adopted 2 dogs from the local shelter, and slowly began building the normal life they had never thought possible. Sometimes late at night, Emma would wake up and check the locks on the doors, old habits dying hard. And sometimes David would catch himself looking over his shoulder when they were in crowded places. But mostly they lived the quiet, unremarkable life that had once seemed impossible. They watched movies, argued about what to plant in their garden, and made plans for a future that finally belonged to them. The shadows of the past still existed, but they no longer controlled their lives. For the first time in 15 years, Elizabeth Cole was truly free. And for the first time in his life, Mark Thompson understood what it meant to love someone enough to disappear with them into a better life. On their first wedding anniversary, Emma found David reading in their backyard, a biography of people who had started over in witness protection. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling beside him in the evening light. David closed the book and looked at the woman he'd followed across 3 states and into a completely new identity. "Only one," he said. Emma's heart skipped. "What's that?" "I wish I'd found that hidden box sooner," he said, pulling her close. "We could have had more time together." Emma laughed and kissed him, and in that moment neither of them looked over their shoulders or worried about the past. They were David and Emma Stevens, and they were home.